Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I'm the host of Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. In this week's episode, I would like to focus our conversation on one of the most important yet rarely considered topics in our lives: what it means to be human. Yeah, like with all our conversations, what it means to be human, while it's really important, is something that can obviously lead to a vitriolic exchange and people just canceling their subscription and such. But that's not how we have conversations here on Breadcrumbs. So before we get into what it means to be human, I want to remind you, as I do with each of my episodes, that we will approach this conversation not on the basis of what makes us different, but we will approach this conversation on the basis of our shared experience and our shared humanity. And why? We do this because we need a common basis by which, for you and me individually, to assess what we're talking about, the information that we exchange, and that we use the basis of that assessment, our lived experiences, many of which are shared experiences, so that you have a measure of, is this true? Does this make sense, what's being said? Is there facts being drawn that I know to be untrue? We need to have an independent basis that does not involve you trusting me or me trusting you, for us to decide whether the conversation we're about to have resonates with each of us as individuals. And it's on that basis that you know if you can trust the information, because it makes sense based on your lived experience, based on our shared humanity. Okay, so this is how we're going to address the question of what it means to be human, because it's a really important question, and it's long overdue for us to have that conversation. So here we go. I want to start off by saying, and it's a confession. Yeah, I know I'm recording this on Saturday. So I guess for some religions that might be church day, but for others, so be it. But my confession is I had never considered this topic in the first 50 years of my life: what it means to be human. Hmm. But when I went through that crisis moment, which I've discussed in episode 0 and in episode 3 and other places, where I had to reconsider my whole life because I realized I didn't know who I was. One of the things I discovered was the fact that I had never considered what it means to be human. And what I discovered as I was going through that process is the reason why I had never considered that is because I was living a very normal life in the modern world. And one of the basic modalities that define modernity is we live in a very multitasking function. That's how we live. We multitask. Okay. And we do it so much that we take it for granted. Okay. But the idea is we're moving fast. We're trying to be highly productive. We're competing hard. Technology and innovation is rampant. We got to stay on top of things. Yeah, we got 12 screens open on our desktops, that type of thing. Okay. So multitasking was very normal and involves you doing multiple things at the same time, but those things have a priority. And so your primary focus and attention is on the top issue, whatever that is. But there's a series of functions that we get used to doing in the background that allows us to accomplish multiple things at the same time. And so I had never considered what it means to be human because that just didn't make it to the top of my priority list in my multitasking functionality every day of my modern, busy, and quite successful life. So there I was in my 50s, considering, well, what does it mean to be human? Okay. But when we examine, and I want you to look at your lived experience and tell me if you had considered in a serious way what it means to be human, and if you have, put your conclusions that you had made before this conversation in the notes for this podcast because we need to know. That would be a major contributor to this conversation because I'm going to go through some things that address that topic that I hope resonate with you. And once again, if it doesn't, put it in the comments because we need to know why not. So back to this thing of multitasking. So the pros is you're more productive. You get to focus your attention on the interesting task. The other tasks are kind of mundane and repetitious. And the more mundane and repetitious they are, the more of those tasks you can operate in the background. But it also aligns with how our senses work because those senses are hypersensitive to change. So if you're in a quiet room and someone is tapping a pencil in a consistent way, and they just tap, 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 tap. First, it's going to be annoying. And then everyone in the room, their hearing is going to adjust for the tap, 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 tap. And then that will fade out. And the next other sound, everyone will hear that first. So that's how our senses work. So the idea that multitasking allows you to take the primary task and maintain that sensitivity to notice the change first allows you to be productive and do these rote tasks simultaneously and still notice the change first. So it kind of lent itself to how our bodies work, how our physiology works, how our senses work. The downside to it is it does degrade the quality of our work. It degrades the quality of every one of the tasks we do. And even though as professionals, we may get that work to be good enough, to pass muster, good enough not to blow up our jobs, good enough not to lose deals, it's still not our best work. So that's one of the downsides. Another one of the downsides is the fact that all those tasks outside of the primary task run on autopilot. And the downside of autopilot is these functions that we resign to autopilot are outside of our conscious consideration. Yeah, we'll talk about that and have examples to back that up. But further, how those tasks that are done on autopilot function is they function based on the expectations that things are going to go in the way they have always gone. And therefore, for those autopilot tasks, you lose the sensitivity to change. If you bang into a change on something that's autopilot, like your route home from work and you're thinking about 12 different things, and all of a sudden you see a detour sign, your drive home is going to shift from autopilot to the primary focus because that's the only way you can deal with that change. So the downside with autopilot is you can't do functions on autopilot and deal with change because it's beyond your conscious consideration and it takes conscious consideration to account for changes. All right. Now, I gave you one example of the autopilot, your drive home. But I want to give you an example of the drive home where you're trying to impose a change and you stay on autopilot. So as opposed to the detour on the way home, which stops you from thinking whatever you were thinking so that you could focus in on how am I going to get home now. Imagine before you leave work and you're taking the route that you always take home, right? You call home and you ask your honey bunny, do I need to stop and bring anything home? They tell you, yes, if you would bring a carton of eggs and a bottle of wine. It's been that kind of day. Okay, great. I'll pick up a bottle of wine, and I know your favorite, and a carton of eggs for breakfast tomorrow. Good to go. Then you jump in the car and you go into your autopilot because you had a heck of a day and you got to strategize about how you're going to deal with this problem, this nightmare that you're coming back to tomorrow morning after breakfast with them eggs. So you're deep into figuring out how you're going to do this. And what happens? The next thing you know, you're sitting in the driveway. No eggs, no wine. Okay. What happened there is that you did plan on changing your route, but you started it, your normal route, you put it on autopilot, and when the supermarket came into view, you weren't thinking about the supermarket. You were still thinking about how you're going to solve that problem tomorrow when you get back to work. And therefore, you stuck to the autopilot and forgot to get the wine and the eggs. Okay, so this is the downside to the autopilot. It literally is outside of our conscious consideration that then does not allow us to consider changes as they occur. But it's worse than just these simple things like getting the eggs and the bottle of wine on the way home from work. We go through periods of time in our life when we find that the pattern of our lives become consistent in any way, it lends itself to a rut where what's my daily week? Well, we got meatloaf Tuesdays, we got fish stick Fridays, and so on and so forth. Everything, when it feels like it's in a rut, goes on autopilot and it feels gray. There's no, the autopilot is dominated by the expectation that you already know what to expect. It's just going to be the same meatloaf that you get every Tuesday. It's just going to be the same fish sticks that you get every Friday. You know, my God, if I eat those fish sticks one more time, it's going to be projectile across the room, whatever. So this is what we do every time we recognize patterns. And the worst part of this autopilot function is we actually do it to each other. When the functions that we do on autopilot get to the point where we already know what to expect and we're able to do those functions over and over and over again, like driving home or waking up next to the same person, all of a sudden you can go weeks from actually showing up in the current moment and taking a look to see if anything has actually changed. And that's how we lose each other in relationships. Literally, we put our spouses, our lovers, our companions on autopilot. They turn gray. We already think we know what they're going to say. We already think we know how they feel because the last time we paid attention, we were right. But we hadn't noticed the fact that they're in constant state of change, just like we are in constant state of change. And therefore, we're actually wrong. Our expectations are actually wrong. They are not feeling the same way. They're not thinking the same thing. They wish that you would notice that things have changed. Maybe they changed their hair a little bit or whatever. The point is, this autopilot thing is what we do to each other. And when we put another human being on autopilot, they lose all the things that would make them interesting or grayed out. And why? Because we don't notice. We already think we know. Yeah. I have a commentary that addresses that issue. It says expectations are self-imposed Truman Show because that's exactly how autopilot functions. These are a series of tasks dominated by an expectation that how we're going to do them is how we're going to do them every time. And all we have to do is do the same thing each time and they will get done. And the more we do them that way, and the more it gets done that way, the more we're convinced that that expectation is right. When the fact is, over time, it's increasingly wrong until it just doesn't work anymore. And we do that in the smallest tasks, and we do that in our most important relationships. The good news is, and that's what this podcast is all about, is how we unpack the autopilot. How do we reclaim our discretionary authority? How do we reclaim our conscious consideration for things that are important that we have put on autopilot. Because after 50 years building my life, I realized that I never asked myself or never considered what it means to be human because I had taken it for granted that I was human. So I never needed to consider what it means to be human. So, breadcrumb number one is because we put the predictable functions in a multitasking modality on autopilot because they're no longer interesting. There's no change that we expect to be occurring there. Some of the most important considerations are placed on autopilot beyond the range of our conscious consideration. And first and foremost, it is our survival functions. Yeah. Breadcrumb number one, we have assigned our survival functions to autopilot, which excludes them from our conscious consideration unless they are immediately at risk. And so, what is he talking about? Well, here we go. Since we started this conversation, we have taken many breaths, you and I. But we don't think about taking the breaths. And we go through days, weeks, months, maybe even years, and never consider, oh, I'm breathing. And what does that actually feel like to breathe? Hopefully, you join me in taking that breath. The point is, breathing feels really good. There's a joy that when your lungs fill up and then let go and empty. It's a joy to that process. But literally, we go through days, weeks, months, never even considering it. And so our breath is functioning on autopilot. And in that context, we're just breathing enough for us to get enough air to not have to draw our primary attention to breathing so that it can stay running in the background. But the problem with that is, as our day goes up and down, as the tension occurs, as the pace occurs, and stuff like that, our breathing is not really moderating in the most efficient way. And this is why sometimes we feel when our day is becoming stressful, our chest tightens. Why? We're not breathing right. And the thing about it is, proof of that pudding is shared experience. When's the last time that you realized that you were under a lot of pressure and you remembered to stop for a second? Stop running, stop spinning, stop fixing, and do what? And what it does is it resets you. When you remember to do that, it resets you. But what is the lesson there? The lesson there is in the absence of your conscious bringing your breath into your primary function off the autopilot. You don't modify your breathing to really accommodate what you're experiencing in order to optimize the air and the calm and the energy that we derive from breathing. And so oftentimes, again, we go through a day and these breaths are short, shallow breaths. They're not the full, rich, deep breaths that really serve us. And doing that too long affects your health. Okay, but that's another story. So yeah, breathing. We don't ever think about the water that we need until the water becomes scarce. Why? Because it's always there. We always have it available somewhere. And therefore we don't consider it. And so yeah, in many ways, the things that we do that allows us to survive, that allows us to function every day, they're the most mundane things. They're the things that modern society provides for. And therefore, we don't have to give it primary consideration. And so they fall out of our consideration. So yeah, breadcrumb number one, we have assigned our survival functions to autopilot, which excludes them from our conscious consideration. And that leads us to breadcrumb number two. Because we assign our more mundane functions to autopilot as we're multitasking the change and the interesting and the more stimulating functions. We resign the consideration of what it means to be human to autopilot, and it too falls out of our and my conscious consideration. So the reason why I never considered it in the first 50 years of my life plus was because it never met the primary priority. Why? It wasn't particularly interesting because me being human was a given. I took it for granted. And you do too. If you don't, put it in the notes. And tell me how you've been thinking about what it means to be human and what that means to your life, because I would love to know. Because I know this much. Once I realized what it means to be human, it totally changed my life. Because the way I was thinking when I didn't think about what it means to be human was totally and radically different than the consideration that comes from remembering what it is to be human. So if you had remembered earlier than this conversation, put it in the notes so that you can share your journey of how it changed you, because that's only affirmation of what I went through too. Shared experience. Okay. Thank you for that. So, yeah, because we rarely consider what it means to be human, because we take being human for granted, it puts our critical functions, our survival, at risk. Now, what is he saying? Well, if we're making conscious decisions, the primary function of our multitasking is where our conscious decisioning is. Whether or not we should develop this property, whether or not how are we competing in our economy, what our lifestyle is going to be, how much greenhouse gas emissions are we willing to admit? Well, I need to use them fossil fuels to do all the things I do to support my lifestyle and this and that, right? Those considerations, if those considerations don't consider if they have any impact on your survival, because your survival functions are not in your active consideration, your conscious consideration, then you might be making some choices over here that put your survival at risk. And that's exactly where we are. So, yeah, breadcrumb number 2 is that the fact that we put what it means to be human on autopilot actually places our survival at risk, because it places our survival that is required for being human outside of our conscious consideration. Which leads us to breadcrumb number 3. By the way, there's 7 breadcrumbs in this episode. Breadcrumb number 3 is, as humans, our survival relies on many species of life and the contributions of many people neither one of us will ever know, and the natural environment that sustains all of us and none of us can control. Yeah, breadcrumb number 3. Our survival relies on all those things. We can't survive without bees, pollinators. Our food supply goes away. In fact, our food supply is other species, whether you're talking about plants, cows, pigs, fish, right? Humans can't survive without many, many species. Humans can't survive. Each of us can't survive without tens of thousands of humans doing what they do every day to make sure that we eat, that we have fresh water, that electricity runs to our house, that we have clothes to wear, all this other stuff, that we have houses to live in. Yeah, all this is produced by people, most of which we never know. And the time that they mess up, the time that they're distracted from doing what they do, this is how our lives get messed up. This is when we get the salmonella from eating the stuff. This is when the brakes don't work. Our survival relies on the existence of many other living species, on the contributions from thousands of people we will never know, and on the natural environment that sustains all of us. Which leads us, we're rolling with the breadcrumbs. Breadcrumb number 4. Because we assign our survival functions to autopilot, our conscious decisions do not consider the residual impacts on the complex web of contributors we need to survive. Let that sink in. Because we assign our survival functions to autopilot, our conscious decisions do not consider the residual impacts those decisions have on the complex webs of contributors we rely on to survive every day. Yeah. If you don't agree with that statement, please put your comments in the notes below. So I've given you 4 breadcrumbs in a row because they just build on each other. But the implications are this. What it means to be human is that we don't produce the conditions we require to live. Consider that. None of us do. We do not produce the conditions we require to live. Further, what it means to be human is that the quality of our lives are a function of the ability of all those contributors, complex web of contributors, their ability to provide for the conditions we need to live. To the extent that they do what they do well, we thrive. And to the extent that they can't do what they do well, we suffer badly. COVID-19 is a perfect example of what I'm speaking about. The United States has 4% of the global population. And we are, if not the wealthiest country in the world, amongst, by far, the top 1 or 2 wealthiest countries in the world. And yet we had 25% of the COVID deaths on the planet. And the way that happened is that the essential contributors in terms of our food have not served the American people well. The quality of our food has led to a severe degradation of our health. And I've covered this in prior episodes of Breadcrumbs, where the federal regulators who regulate nutrition and food quality, bought and paid for by Big Ag and Big Food to produce horrible quality food that we feed to our working class and middle class folks. So bad is the quality of this food that most of our allies will not let us export that food based on how they're made in that way to our allied countries in Europe or in Canada. No. So what do US-based food manufacturers do? They abide by the regulations of our allies and provide better food for those people than the food they feed Americans. Just saying. And so this is what happens when one of the major contributors do not provide as well as they can provide, that it impacts our health. And we experience it the first time we have any type of meaningful challenge to our health, as we did with COVID-19. So yeah, the quality of our lives is a function of the ability of all necessary contributors who provide the conditions we rely on every day to live. And so what this means is, if we don't produce the conditions we require to live, and that if the quality of our life is a function of the ability of all those complex web of contributors, their ability to provide for our conditions that we require to live, what that says is that we live interdependently. Interdependently. Our living is a function of those contributions. And this really calls into question how we define the word freedom. It calls into question how we define the word independence. It calls into question how we define self-interest, because these are things that are informing our conscious decisioning. A conscious decisioning, as I have mentioned, that do not consider our survival functions, because our survival functions are on autopilot unless they are directly threatened. And therefore, they're outside of the range of our conscious consideration. And this is what feeds the problem we find ourselves in today. So we live interdependently with the rest of the lives on Earth. All those different animals we rely on, all those different plants we rely on. We inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. The trees inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. And then we get to breathe again, and the trees get more carbon, and then we get more oxygen. That's how it works. That's interdependence. Okay? We can't function without it. So when we're deciding on the Amazon rainforest, when we're deciding on various forms of development, it is existentially dangerous for us not to consider what function those ecologies have in supporting human life. And right now, that's not a consideration, and it shows. Therefore, if we live interdependently on all life on Earth and the natural environment that sustains us, we cannot advance our self-interest at the expense of those contributors. And if you look around us right now and you look at every problem, major problem that we face, the four existential problems I discussed in last week's episode, Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus, talking about four existential challenges that no individual nation can handle by themselves. Yeah, when we look at all those problems, they stem out of a consideration that does not consider our survival functions, that does not consider what impact those decisions are having on the complex web of contributors who are essential to our daily survival. And as a result, we are making choices that put our survival at risk. Let me be plain. The reason why, when we talk about the climate crisis, people are saying there is no way I'm giving up the use of fossil fuels. I'm not giving up my lifestyle. All right. The reason why they can say that is they're not considering the fact that the greenhouse gas emissions that our lifestyles are emitting in this atmosphere that are warming the planet, that has killed 70% of all species on the earth, it is an extinct, right, since 1970, that we are imposing an existential threat to humanity that will play out over the next, 100 years? But certain. And we're doing it without even considering that impact, because our survival is not immediately at risk, and therefore it stays on autopilot. But we need to take it out of the shadow. We need to take it out of the shadow. So when we consider what it means to be human, and we recognize, as I've said in these 4 points, it leads us into breadcrumb number 5. And this one is a fun one, but it's a lesson. Why do our pets give us unconditional love? Now, if you have a pet, go take a look, because you should know already. Mine is right over here. She's back here. There she goes. That's Juno. Why do they give us unconditional love? Well, when you look at them and you see how they look at you, it's really clear. Our pets give us unconditional love because they're not confused about who takes care of them every day. Yeah, they're not confused about who takes care of them every day. And let's not get it twisted. Our pets are not stupid. There are horrible people, humans, amongst us who abuse their pets. Those pets don't love abusers unconditionally. Our pets love us unconditionally because we actually take care of them. And for that, they are done. It's open hearted. That's my human. We're one. No one touched a human. That's my human. That's how they feel. Okay. Well, when I went through my crisis moment and I went through the process of remembering what it means to be human, I never forgot. I no longer get confused over who takes care of me. And to honor that, I wrote a commentary called Why Loving You Doesn't Make Me a Dreamer. I love you because you decided to have me. You carried me and nourished me in your body for 40 weeks. You taught me the language that expresses my thoughts and frames my dreams. You raised me. You educated me, believed in me long before I knew who I could be. Your efforts, discoveries, and choices produced the body of knowledge I use daily to contribute to the world around me. I'm able to work because you paved the roads that lead to my job, built the car that I drive, and completed all the repairs that allows my car to run. You produce my food, my shelter, my safety, and everything I'm unable to produce for myself. I do participate in my success, but compared to your contribution, my efforts seem nearly meaningless. So, yes, I love you because given all you do, loving you is the most rational, practical, and obvious thing I can do. Yeah, that is a commentary from Onward at Last 2024 Presidential Election Edition. So that leads us to breadcrumb number 6. What does it mean to be human? It means never taking for granted everyone and everything that contributes to making our lives worth living. Never taking for granted all the contributors, human and non-human, that are essential for us to live every day. If you disagree with that view of what it means to be human, seriously, I would love to hear your thoughtful comment in the notes for this podcast. But that's what it distills down to. You can't be human and receive all we receive and live every day and then turn around and harm the very hands that feed us, that give us air, that give us clean water, that love us unconditionally by the things that they do for us daily. Yeah, you can't be human if you can receive all that and then roll over and go to sleep while the very people who support you are suffering. So look around you, because they are. So what are the implications of this discussion? Well, and that becomes our concluding breadcrumb for today. Breadcrumb number 7. Learn the lesson our pets model for us every day. Yeah, you can learn something from Juno. I do. Love unconditionally everyone and everything that contributes to you living your life every day. It's that simple. This is what it means to be human. Well, this is Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. In this episode, we discuss what it means to be human. It's not complex. It really is tied to how we survive every day and what allows us to survive every day, and honoring the fact that in the absence of those things, we can't do anything that we do. And therefore, like any human, we should function from a place of gratefulness and reciprocity to provide and encourage and nurture all the people who do that for us. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you'll take to heart. It's a simple message, but it's an undeniable message. Truth often is as simple as an adage or a saying that people say, oh, I know that. Yeah. Do more than know it. Live it. Be it. Because this is what we are. We're human. And what it means to be human is to honor those who allow us to do what we do every day. Thank you for your time. You take care. And I'll see you next time in the conversation.